about publications. Sorry. I don't know. Sorry. It's an echo, Maddie. If you have news, a publication, a presentation, an award, anything like that, send it to CSDE at UW, and the person behind there is well. So without further ado, oh, one more thing, there's a lunch for graduate students with our visitor. And so don't, if you didn't sign up for the lunch, that's okay, come anyway. It's in 223. It's in 223 Ray Hall. And also, if you're going to be a regular attendee, pick up your punch card, get 6 punches, and you're listed in a drawing. You've been attending in person in this wonderful space that has been given to us by the Evans School. So we're really happy and grateful for that. Okay, so without further ado, let me welcome our speaker, Dr. Lee Senderowicz, who is visiting from the University of Wisconsin. She's an assistant professor in gender and women's studies at the University of Wisconsin, and she also has an appointment in global OBGYN health. She's unusually, she's in a cluster of scholars in that department who do social science research around reproductive health concerns. So that's kind of a cool institutional innovation, I think, for the University of Wisconsin. And they also have a job opening search going on right now.
Earth equity.
Earth equity, so those of you who might be interested in that, ask her later. So Dr. Senderowicz is a public health researcher and a feminist social demographer, focusing on global sexual and reproductive health and rights, race, gender, and coloniality. So very interesting for our community, where we have a lot of affiliates who are working at that intersection or different angles of that intersection. And she's particularly, she combines mixed methods, so quantitative and qualitative work, and she focuses on contraceptive autonomy and exploring the ways that new approaches to measurement and evaluation can promote in-person, person-centered care, health equity, and reproductive freedom. I'm not going to go on longer. We're going to learn a lot about her. She has an impressive resume, and we're really thrilled to have you here. Thank you for sharing your time.
Thank you so much for that. This mic's on, right? Yes, okay. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Sarah. Thank you to Sarah and to Rowan and to Maddie and to Michelle and to everyone else who played a role in bringing me to this room today to be with all of you. I'm really excited and a little bit overwhelmed by this turnout. This is incredible. All right, let me get my screen sharing going. So do that. Can I do that? Can I do that? Can I do that? Okay, we got it. We got it going. And let me move this away from my notes. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm an interdisciplinary mixed methods researcher. I have a background in global health, social demography, and gender studies. And I spend a lot of time thinking about the ways that there's this feedback loop, right, between what we measure and what programs do, and then what we measure and then what programs do. And with the understanding that what we measure impacts how we understand the social world around us, I look at reproductive health indicators as a gendered and racialized form of knowledge production. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that strain of my research in relation to coercion and autonomy in contemporary global family planning programs. There we go. So just to give you an idea of where we're going today, I'm going to start with some background on coercion in global family planning and sort of rationale for this project to exist. I'll talk a little bit about what I call the tacit ideology of family planning measurements. I'll spend the bulk of our time on the contraceptive autonomy study, which is sort of the centerpiece of my research agenda. I'll share some of the findings from this study on contraceptive coercion and talk about some of what we're doing and some of the challenges we're facing as we try to create new family planning measurements. And then I'll finish with a few words about what I hope we can all take away from this work. So I like to get started with some context and some background. And I always like to ask the question, why do we care about family planning? How do we all, when we have a room full of family planning advocates, how did those people get into that room? And family planning is a really interesting area because it brings a lot of different people together that you wouldn't necessarily expect to sort of share the same goals. So in the global discourse on family planning, we have people who have sort of come to make the pro-family planning arguments for a feminist rationale, where contraception is something that we need to promote bodily autonomy and reproductive rights. There's an environmental rationale to promote contraception as a way that we can protect biodiversity or alleviate climate change. An economic rationale to reduce poverty and achieve a demographic dividend, and a public health rationale to promote both maternal and child health. So in a family planning advocacy room, you might have environmentalists and feminists and economists and public health people all there for these different reasons. And this screenshot, the type's a little small, I'm sorry about that, but this is a screenshot from a family planning advocacy website that shows how several of these arguments are deployed at once. They frame family planning as, quote, the smartest investment we can make, capable of improving outcomes in everything from HIV/AIDS to education, sanitation, malaria, as well as bringing significant savings across sectors. And in this way, family planning is portrayed as a panacea or a silver bullet to the multidimensional challenges of global poverty, unsafe living conditions, and ill health. And with so much upside and no stated downside, the challenge for family planning practitioners has been framed as how we can maximize contraceptive uptake to its highest levels possible. But of course, we need to remember that despite all of these purported benefits, family planning has not always been part of an emancipatory project for all people. Rather, family planning has been tied in with a range of efforts, both to control fertility overall, as well as to decide whose bodies are targeted for fertility reduction. In the United States, the eugenics movement targeted the bodies of minoritized racial and ethnic groups, disabled people, and people living in poverty, among others, for compulsory sterilization. This is a photo of civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer, who many of you may know for her work on civil rights and voting rights in particular. But Ms. Hamer also helped us to know the term Mississippi appendectomy, which is a slang term to describe involuntary sterilization that was used commonly by Black women throughout the US South. This actually happened to Ms. Hamer herself when she was given a non-consented radical hysterectomy in 1961 when she was undergoing surgery for a small tumor at the hands of a white doctor. In the global South, neo-Malthusian concerns about global overpopulation were really central to the birth of the international development sector after the Second World War. The US Agency for International Development, USAID, was founded in 1961, and that very same year as its founding, it began funding family planning research as one of its very first activities. I'm sorry, this is small type again here, but this is a screenshot from the USA Family Planning website. And you can see here how Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, so Democrats and Republicans, were all motivating US development assistance for global family planning as a way to control overpopulation in poor countries. President Johnson said that he would seek new ways to use our knowledge to help deal with the explosion in world population and the growing scarcity of world resources. While President Nixon, there it goes. President Nixon described population growth as one of the most serious challenges to human destiny in the last third of the century. So given these stakes, like think about this, most serious challenges to human destiny, these are apocalyptic stakes that we're talking about. So given those stakes, the legitimacy of coercion in the pursuit of fertility decline was frequently affirmed throughout this era. The president of the Population Council in 1979 was a guy named Bernard Berelson, and he and a co-author published this article in PBR advocating for what they called a stepladder approach to dealing with the so-called population problem. Berelson wrote that there are undoubtedly cases of justified coercion, but he cautioned that overt violence or other potentially injurious coercion is not to be used before non-injurious coercion has been exhausted. So basically try to use the least harmful coercion you can to get the results that you feel you need. Many countries in the global south during this time adopted population policies that included things like economic penalties for high fertility, recruitment quotas for providers, and compulsory sterilization for women, and very briefly for men in India, although that did not last long at all. In Singapore, for example, you can see this messaging here in the green. If I talk, is that okay? Okay. So you can see that Singapore's messaging here in the green. In Singapore, there were financial penalties levied among families who had more than 2 children. And in India, actually to this day, there are still financial payments and other incentives for women who agree to get sterilized. And you can see here, it's based on the amount that they get is based on how many children they already have. So if you agree to get sterilized sort of like earlier in your reproductive life course with a lower parity, you get more money than if you get sterilized later after you've already had more children. Feminist scholars have described the ways that scientific racism, medical misogyny, and Western hegemony have been part of the development project since the beginning, and the particular ways that the gendered and the racialized logics of global family planning have targeted poor women of color living in poor countries for fertility reduction. And really importantly, feminists from around the world have organized to contest the types of reproductive violence that were being perpetrated in the name of population control. Here you have a poster from a San Francisco-based artist named Rachel Romero, who created this image in 1977 to contest the forced sterilizations that were going on in California at the time. And all of this came to a head very famously in 1994. That's the year that the United Nations held the International Conference on Population and Development, ICPD, in Cairo. And this Cairo conference became the really well-known reckoning, right? Where a substantial and well-organized feminist opposition confronted the population control establishment and demanded an end to coercive family planning. And so to quote this article from The Lancet, the Cairo conference put the ideas of comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights, choice, women's empowerment, a life cycle approach, and gender equity at the center of the international agenda, and signaled the end of the so-called population era. And there's this claim that the Cairo conference really changed everything. We have what folks call the post-Cairo shift, in which this focus on population control and demographic targets is supposed to be replaced by a much more holistic focus on gender equity, rights, and health. But the central argument of my talk today will be that this post-Cairo shift has actually been much more successful as a rhetorical shift in terms of changing what we talk about when we talk about family planning. And it's been much less successful or complete as a substantive shift in terms of changing what we do. And I'll argue that this focus on fertility reduction still remains very much intact in global family planning programs today. So I'll show some examples of state-sanctioned contraceptive coercion since Cairo. There have been efforts to control fertility overall, like the one-child policy that was in effect in China until 2016. There have been sterilization camps like these that also operated through 2016, this time in India. There have been efforts focusing on ethnic minorities, like this example from Peru, where indigenous women were targeted by the Fujimori government between 1996 and 2000. Efforts focusing on people living with chronic diseases or women with disabilities. This is an example where women with HIV were targeted from Namibia in 2012. We have examples where, certainly many examples where women of color and women of African descent in particular are targeted, like this example from Israel from 2013. Examples where people who are trans or gender non-conforming are targeted, like this example from France from 2017. Certainly many examples where people living in poverty are targeted, like this example from Australia from 2014. Examples where people with intellectual disabilities are targeted, like this case from the UK from, I think, 2015, if I'm not mistaken. Many examples from the US. This one was the one that I decided to show you today. An example where incarcerated people were being targeted. This took place in 2017 in Tennessee. And what I've now showed you is examples of contemporary contraceptive coercion from every inhabited continent in the world, targeting just about every type of marginalized group you can think of across axes of race, ethnicity, gender, disability, class, geography, coloniality, you name it. Like if we're stratifying society in that way, we're also trying to stratify reproduction in that way. Now, some of you might be thinking, and quite fairly, that these sort of headline-making cases of human rights abuses are a really far cry from how mainstream family planning operates day to day. It's really important to note that virtually all mainstream family planning programs have denounced this type of overt coercion, and they really take a lot of care to inform the importance of voluntarism in their programs. So you'll hear almost every mention of family planning in global development qualified by voluntary. We don't talk really about family planning, we talk about voluntary family planning. And that's been a really strong push that has been made in the past few years. So it would be easy, I think, to dismiss these types of cases as outliers, maybe the results of a few rogue providers or an out-of-touch bureaucrat who doesn't really get it, but not necessarily emblematic of what mainstream family planning is actually trying to do. And yet the reality of stratified reproduction and this ideological focus on keeping certain types of people in certain places from having too many babies, I argue really does remain woven through the heart of contemporary family planning today. And I think you can really see that if you look at our research agenda. And so I'm gonna take a moment to talk about what I call the tacit ideology of measurement. And I know I don't need to convince this particular audience of demographers and population researchers that measurement matters. You all know that, that's why you're here. You wouldn't be here if you didn't think that. But I really love this quote from an anthropologist named Sally Ingham Mary, who wrote this book called The Seductions of Quantification a few years ago. And Mary writes that statistical knowledge is often viewed as non-political by its creators and users. It flies under the radar of social and political analysis as a form of power. Yet how such numerical assessments are created, produced, cast into the world, and used has significant implications for the way the world is understood and governed. And so what Mary is saying here, and what I've really taken from her work, is that although indicators may seem like objective counts of a given phenomenon, what we choose to measure and how we choose to measure that thing are actually political decisions that reflect the political worldviews of the people who are making them. So I spend a lot of time in my work thinking about the intellectual history of our field. What were the tacit ideologies of the people who were creating our global family planning measures at their inception? What types of power and sort of political worldview are these family planning indicators wielding? Whose worldviews do these indicators help us to understand? And really importantly, whose worldviews do our current suite of indicators obscure from us? And so here's a list of the core indicators that we use in family planning today. This is from the USA Data for Impact project. And you can see here things like a couple years of protection, method mix, CPR, MCPR, unmet need, sort of your usual family planning measures. There are measures of contraceptive knowledge, age-specific fertility outcomes, things like that. But it actually really sort of took my breath away the first time I realized that not one of these measures can tell you anything about, health. You can't learn anything about people's health from these indicators. You can't learn anything about rights. There's nothing about access, and there's nothing about equity. So if we really have sort of undergone this post-Cairo shift where now we care about these things, why isn't our measurement agenda reflecting that? And so I'm arguing that we're at a point now where there's a really fundamental misalignment between what we say we care about on the one hand and what we're measuring on the other hand. Here's another example of this. This is from the Bulletin of the World Health Organization from a few years ago. The WHO convened a meeting of global family planning experts to conduct a priority setting exercise for family planning research. So they got all these experts in a room together and asked them, what should we be caring about looking forward in our measurement agenda? And I'm zooming in on this table so you can see that the #1 area of interest was, something's going on here with the clicker. The #1 area of interest was to identify barriers to uptake. The number 2 area of interest was how to improve uptake. The number 3 area of interest was determine strategies to increase uptake. And the number 4 priority was to identify effective strategies to overcome barriers to uptake. Now, I'm being a little bit unfair here because there are distinctions here between post-abortion uptake and postpartum uptake. And there's a little bit of nuance. But what we can see here is that there's a really overwhelming focus, even moving towards the future, on contraceptive uptake. And I think that this is a really good reflection of the ways that the tacit ideology of family planning measurement and research is still firmly based in a population control mentality. And of course, this is not just a question of academic interest, right? But has really important implications for how programs get funded and designed and implemented and evaluated. That's what Michelle can tell us, I think, better than most. And nowhere is this truer than in the global health world, where the importance of a discrete set of quantitative indicators for target setting can scarcely be overstated. This has been especially the case in the family planning world in the past decade, 15 years. Some of you may already be familiar with this initiative that was called initially FP 2020. Family Planning 2020 now is called FP 2030. And this was a global initiative started in 2012, led in large part by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in collaboration with DFID, which was the British development agency at the time. And FP 2020's main objective was to add 120 million additional users of modern contraceptive methods by 2020 in the world's poorest countries. This is an article written by the program's architects, so these are not my words, these are their words. And they also said that the success of FP 2020 will first be evaluated on the basis of quantitative verification to determine that the 120 by 20 goal was reached. That overarching target, 120 million, in turn spawned a set of regional and national goals that were sort of quantified in a similar way. So basically countries or regional initiatives would make pledges to the FP20 initiative. This is how many of that 120 million we will be responsible for. Here's an example of that. 9 Francophone West African countries came together to form the Ouagadougou Partnership. And together, this partnership pledged to add 2.2 million additional family planning users in those 9 countries by 2020. Here is an example of Ghana's plan, sort of commitment to the FP 2020 agenda. This included an aim to increase modern contraceptive prevalence from 22% to 30% among married women, from 32% to 40% among unmarried women. And really notably for me is this sort of second box, where you can see that they also affirmed a population policy goal of reducing total fertility from 5.5 children to 3 children. And some governments set even more specific goals than that. This is a screenshot from the Burkina Faso National Plan to Accelerate Family Planning that they made as part of their FP 2020 commitment. And if your French is a little bit rusty, I will translate it into English for you. And so here you can see that the government set an overall target, not only of getting modern contraceptive prevalence up to 32% by 2020, but they also set method-specific targets of how they wanted to get there. And this plan for increasing contraceptive use focused very specifically on long and medium-acting methods, so implants, injectables, and IUDs. And so really it was this global context that led to the 2 overarching research questions that keep me up at night and guide my research agenda. The first is, what happens to people's experiences if it's fertility goals that are driving family planning programs? What's the impact of that on people's reproductive well-being? The second question is, given the importance of quantitative measures, how can we design new measures that can assess and promote this post-Cairo agenda of reproductive health and autonomy, as opposed to continuing to measure this pre-Cairo agenda of fertility control? And so that's what inspired the contraceptive autonomy study. The goals of this study are to better understand how contraceptive coercion can manifest and to build really from scratch sort of a fundamentally new approach to global family planning measurement that's based in person-centered care and reproductive freedom. So I'll spend the rest of our time together today talking about this study. It was an exploratory sequential mixed method study that first used a qualitative formative phase to inform the development of novel survey items, which were then tested using a large scale quantitative survey. I'm anonymizing the name of the country today, but it's a country in sub-Saharan Africa that has won acclaim from the international community for its family planning programs. And so the idea is that if coercion is found in this highly visible program, that's like winning all these awards, it's probably reasonable to hypothesize that similar types of coercion are occurring in similarly conceived family planning programs around the world. So our qualitative phase consisted of in-depth interviews with women of reproductive age, focus group discussions, as well as key informant interviews with health administrators. These interviews and focus groups helped us understand what kind of experiences people were having, what types of language they used to talk about those experiences, and that helped us understand what types of survey questions might make sense to accurately gauge those experiences. We then used data from that phase to develop our novel questionnaire, and we implemented our large population-based surveys at 2 different research sites among over 3,900 women of reproductive age. And so I'm going to give just a small taste of our qualitative findings, and then I'm going to jump straight into how we're trying to develop this quantitative measure of contraceptive autonomy. The main thing to come out of our qualitative phase that I want to highlight for you today is what I call sort of a comprehensive theory of coercion. And contraceptive coercion was not something that had been really researched very much or well theorized prior to this. So what I was able to shed some light onto using my data is that coercion sits on a spectrum, that it's structural, and that it's bidirectional. And I'll tell you just a little bit about what I mean by each of these 3 things. So first, the fact that coercion is not a binary thing, yes or no, that might seem, I guess, kind of obvious once I say it, but we weren't thinking about it like this before. We were thinking like, is there coercion or isn't there? Like, was someone sort of held down by force or not? And I argue that it's much more helpful to conceptualize coercion as an array of practices that can limit contraceptive decision-making, ranging from subtle limits on decision-making to more overt limits on contraceptive decision-making. So things like biased counseling, limited method mix, provision of false medical information, those are things that we're mapping here as subtle coercion. Insisting until someone accepts, sort of putting a lot of pressure on them, that's mapped as moderate coercion, and inserting methods without consent or refusing to remove provider-dependent methods, those are mapped onto the more overt end. And so here's an example of what we mean when we talk about subtle coercion. This is Maria's story. And we asked Maria to tell her about her experience with contraceptive counseling. And Maria says, well, the health workers normally counsel you that if you want to choose, you have to choose the 5 years, by which she means the subdermal implant, which has a 5-year use, maximum duration of use. Now, if that method isn't suitable for you, you can take it out and you can get the 3 months, by which she means the injectable contraceptive. But if you don't like that, you can't take it out. You have to wait for the 3 months to be over. Otherwise, you can't remove it. So she's showing like a pretty good understanding of the mechanism of action or how it works. The interviewer asks, so it's the providers who told you? And Maria responds, it's true that there's counseling and they tell you to choose what you like. But what they think is best, it's only the 5 years, the implant. Now, I've called this type of biased and directive counseling subtle coercion. It's clear here that there's no use of threats or violence, so this wouldn't necessarily strike us as something that's coercive on its face. But I think it's really clear that the situation that Maria is describing here is one in which decision-making autonomy is constrained in subtle ways. Here's an example from our in-depth interviews of what we're classifying as more overt coercion. This is Jessica's story. And Jessica says, when I got pregnant with my 10th child, the midwife told me that I have a lot of children and that I would have a difficult delivery. The health workers in a nearby town said that I needed to get the implant by force. I was obligated to accept, and they gave me the implant. The nurse told me that it would be 5 years, and even before the date of the 5th year, I started to feel illnesses due to the implant. I went to the hospital. I went to tell the hospital that I got headaches from the implant. And it's there that the health worker told me that the date to remove it hasn't yet arrived, so he can't remove it. He refused. He said that it hasn't yet been 5 years and there are 2 months that still remain. So there's a lot going on in this excerpt. I'll focus on a couple things. One is that Jessica was forced to get an implant due to a provider's perception of high parity. It does not seem that she was given any choice, A, about whether or not to use a method, and then B, about which method to use. And then finally, instead of viewing that 5-year duration of the contraceptive implant as a maximum period of efficacy, which is the intention of that 5-year period, many, many women told us stories of providers treating that 5-year duration as the minimum duration of use, and sort of categorically refusing to take them out before that full 5-year period has elapsed. So here Jessica just has 2 months to go and the provider wouldn't take it out. And it's clear that she wants to discontinue this method due to experience of side effects that she defines intolerable. So we're calling that more overt coercion. Here's an example of what I'm calling structural coercion. We talked to health administrators whose job it is to sort of oversee and supervise the clinicians. And so we talked to one health administrator who told us that at the district level, we also give goals to each health center so that they can attain the targets. Those that are concerned with all the methods mixed together, but above all, the long-acting methods that we're really emphasizing. This quote, I think, helps us gain an understanding of contraceptive coercion as something that's not stemming from individual malice, but from policies and programs. This isn't a problem of a couple bad apples. This is a problem of bad policy. In much of the thinking about coercion prior to this research, we've tended to think about an intent to coerce, provider bias, things that are sort of happening at the interpersonal level. But what I'm arguing here is that instead of blaming providers, understanding coercion as something that's structural can help us reframe the situation and place the critique back onto the donors and the program designers in the global north. These programs were designed with the express goal of achieving high contraceptive prevalence and high LARC uptake in particular. So then it should come as no surprise to us when rights and autonomy are subordinated to that goal. And if we start thinking about what this administrator is saying about LARC uptake, it kind of helps us understand then why Jessica's provider wouldn't take out the LARC method, right? LARC for, long-acting reversible contraception, IUDs and implants. You need a provider not only to put them in, but to take them. Okay, and then the final piece of this theory of coercion is that coercion is bidirectional. And traditionally, coercion has been thought of really only as when someone is forced to use a contraceptive method that they don't want, like the examples that I just showed you from Jessica. This is indeed very troubling, and it was the overwhelming type of coercion that we found in our research. But what about when people are denied a method that they do want? What if Jessica had wanted an implant and couldn't get one? To me, those are two sides of the exact same coin, right? It's the same dynamics operating to make a decision for the user as opposed to letting the user make the decision for herself. So here I call the inability to use a wanted method a form of downward coercion, in contrast to what we're calling upward coercion that describes Jessica and Maria and the other examples that we've talked about. And so together, bringing these ideas together, this comprehensive theory of coercion rests on the contention that all obstructions to contraceptive autonomy, upward or downward, structural or interpersonal, subtle or overt, should all be understood and analyzed as various iterations of the same process, which is coercion. That was the easy part. Now comes the hard part. How do you measure it? How do you design a measure of this? Because I'm talking about how complex it is and how nuanced, right? Now we're trying to measure using survey questions. We knew we had to do something pretty different from the status quo. So for most of recent history, the outcome of interest for family planning researchers and programmers has been contraceptive use. And we've been measuring this in a pretty straightforward way, where a person using a method is considered a good outcome, and a person not using method is considered a bad outcome or a programmatic failure. And this simple dichotomous measure really rests at the core of just about every population-based measure for family planning that we have, from contraceptive prevalence rate to unmet need. But if we add just one additional criterion to what we measure, and we also examine the extent to which a person wants their method, we can begin to create a more person-centered understanding. So I ask, oops, there we go. If we add the second criterion, is the column to the right still always good? And is the column to the left still always bad? I suggest a new definition of success for family planning that's not at all dependent on the person's status as a contraceptive user or non-user, but rather on concordance between what the person wants and what they have. And it's based on this concordance that I propose this measure of contraceptive autonomy. Now comes the really, really, really hard part. What does it mean to want family planning? How can we create a measurement of this? Because we all know that a lot more goes into autonomous decision-making than just a person's feelings, right? There's a lot more going on here. And so in operationalizing contraceptive autonomy, we wanted to think about the factors that are necessary for a person to decide for themselves what they want in regards to contraception, and then to realize that decision. And I drew from the work of Karen Newman and Charlotte Feldman Jacobs, or yes, Karen Newman and Charlotte Feldman Jacobs. I thought I got their first names reversed, but I didn't. So I drew on their work to come up with these conceptions of informed choice, full choice, and free choice as sort of the three primary subdomains of contraceptive autonomy. Defining informed choice as when a person has sufficient unbiased information about a range of family planning options, including both the benefits and the risks of both use and non-use. For full choice, a person needs to have access to a sufficiently wide range of methods from which to choose. And for free choice, a person needs to make the decision about whether or not to use contraception and what method to use voluntarily without barriers or coercion. And maybe you're seeing some lessons from our qualitative work come through, right, in these definitions. And I'm not gonna, I'd love to talk with anyone who wants to know about like the nitty gritty of how we're, like, what are the survey items to measure each one of these things. For the purposes of brevity today, I'm not gonna go into that level of detail, but I'm sort of gonna stay at the big picture level. But if now we take that understanding of what we mean by contraceptive autonomy back to this contingency table, we can start to now figure out who's gonna fall into each of these cells. In box A are people who have made a free, full, and informed choice not to use family planning, so autonomous non-users. Box B now are people who have a family planning method, but did not have full information access or freedom in that choice. So this might look like upward coercion, right, from our qualitative results. In box C, we have people who do not have a family planning method, but did not have full information access or freedom in that choice. This might look like downward coercion. Might also look a little bit like what unmet needs should be, but that's not what unmet need is actually measuring, but maybe this is a newer understanding of unmet need. And in box D now, we have our fully autonomous users, people who are using contraception and had free, full, and informed choice in the decision. So using the schematic, now we can start to think through how indicators, and I have a lot of ideas. One of them is a revision of the unmet need indicator. But the first and sort of most basic measure that I propose based on the schematic is really simple, and it's a contraceptive autonomy score, A plus D over A plus B plus C plus D. For those of you in this room who don't live in the global family planning soup, you might be asking yourself, like, so what, lady? Like, what is the big deal here? The 2x2 table, what's the big deal? To my knowledge, when I proposed this, it was the first population-based indicator for family planning that gave any credit for any type of autonomous non-use, that acknowledges that people can decide not to use family planning, and that's a perfectly okay outcome. And so the idea here is that if we could pursue contraceptive autonomy targets rather than contraceptive uptake targets, we could eliminate some of these structural incentives for coercion that we were seeing come through in the qualitative results. We piloted our novel survey items based on the schematic in 2018 in Burkina Faso. This was the subject of my doctoral dissertation. And again, I'm not gonna have time today, unfortunately, to dig into the findings, but they're published. And so anyone who's interested should check this out. It's from a special issue of Studies in Family Planning that was focused on measurement innovation. And there are a lot of articles in this special issue that are well worth your time. So what next? Oops, that was a spoiler. This first attempt to measure contraceptive autonomy probably taught us a lot more about what doesn't work in terms of how to measure this very complex construct than it did about what does work. We hit a few things on the head the first time around, but more than that, we learned about what didn't work. And I think there's probably a really long way to go for this measurement. There's some really sticky measurement challenges that we're still trying to figure out. So how to measure free choice is one of those things. I literally do not know. Those qualitative data that I discussed with you earlier suggested to us quite strongly that pressure to use methods and provider reluctance to remove LARC methods is pretty commonplace throughout these communities. Although, of course, qualitative methods cannot be used to capture prevalence, but when something's coming through a lot, very frequently in all of your interviews, it's suggestive of something, right? And so one explanation for why it wasn't coming through as well when we tried to measure it on our quantitative survey is that our qualitative sample was telling us something that wasn't true of the larger population. And that's one perfectly reasonable explanation for this. That the survey was picking up a truer understanding of the general population than what our qualitative. I'm a little bit more inclined to believe that that's not the case and that we actually weren't asking the question in the right way. There's a lot at play here. Some things we've been thinking about are that women might not want to admit to themselves, let alone to a stranger, that they were coerced. They might be doing some post hoc rationalization to deal with cognitive dissonance about, well, I'm a strong person, and so how could I be coerced? Like there's might be some psychological stuff going on here. Social desirability bias, even if you think you were coerced, you might not want to seem like the type of person who gets coerced to an interviewer. Especially if they think that the interviewer might be related in some way to the health system, right? They might not want to seem like they're tattling. I think a big issue that we're going to be facing is the normalization of disrespect and abuse. So people might be treated pretty badly, but feel like that's what this is supposed to be, and not necessarily note that there's something out of order there. So there are a lot of issues that we think are affecting our ability to measure free choice. Some of them we hope might be addressable with more cognitive interviews and better survey questions in the future with more precise wording or a different measurement approach. But we might be also facing a sort of fundamental issue about being able to capture this using survey questions. So we have a lot of work to do on that issue. In terms of our next steps methodologically, we're planning to use a range of multidimensional latent variable modeling techniques, as well as multiple indicator, multiple cause models to try to, right now, the survey burden of measuring this is pretty large. And so we want to try to narrow down the questions to the smallest number that can tell us the most about contraceptive autonomy in a parsimonious way. And hopefully this will help us, this process will also help us generate some evidence of measurement validity, in addition to helping with parsimony. And then we also have another phase of item development and refinement planned qualitatively in Kenya and Nepal, which will help us sort of test the cross-cultural transportability of this autonomy construct that we developed in Burkina Faso. And we're going to analyze that using meta-theme analysis. And this is the subject of my KO1, so I'm really excited to get started on that. The long-term vision for this indicator is to have it be measured around the world. Wherever there's a family planning program, I'd love for the surveys to be measuring this. Routine measurement, I think, is the key. So the ultimate goal is to develop a module that's concise enough and important enough to be added onto pre-existing population-based surveys around the world, like the DHS in the Global South or the NSFG here in the US. And institutionalizing contraceptive autonomy in this way would allow for widespread calculation, including comparisons across time and place, which I think are really where that like incentive piece will come in. You don't want to be the country with the bad contraceptive autonomy numbers, right? Okay, so now just to sum up what I hope we can all take away from this research. the lag with the clicking. There we go. Contraceptive autonomy, this study helps us to conceptualize coercion and autonomy and situate these phenomena as part of a racialized, gendered, and politically contested development initiative. Our study finds that there are a range of coercive practices ranging from the subtle to the overt that can be found even in a model family planning program when that program is motivated by these uptake targets. We hope that new modes of measurement can help show the ways that programs are either providing or failing to provide person-centered care. These results, I think, argue for a decolonial and justice-based approach to global reproductive health that takes away the power of philanthropic capitalism and donors and governments in the global north, and instead resituates the locus of power and decision-making in the communities that are actually affected by these types of policies. And we need to develop a whole range of new quantitative measures that center the voices of contraceptive users and their own desires for their bodies and their lives. And this study is sort of one very small step on that path, but I'm more and more convinced every day that we have a really long way to go. And so with that, I'd really like to thank the funders of this project, and then thank you all so much for listening.
Claps in the chat. I'll let you handle questions from the audience. We do have one online, but I'll read it out loud. It says, how are men incentivized to get sterilized? Well, this is done to women, but I'd like to know how globally this burden is shifted on those and create many more children.
It's not. The only, I'm sure there are more examples that I don't know, but the only sort of widely known example of men being targeted by these types of programs was in India during the emergency period, I believe in the 70s, but someone who knows their Indian history better than I do can correct me on that. Indira Gandhi's government had a very coercive sterilization program that was aimed at men very briefly. And the men got so up in arms about it, they fought back. And that resistance is credited by many for ending Indira Gandhi's reign of power, not reign, but administration, bringing down her administration. And then they shifted to women. So the only time that ever happened, it brought someone out of power and ended forever. So I mean, that the gender focus here is so obvious. Like this is not a approach to fertility control that is evenly targeting all people throughout the world, but is targeting certain types of people based on their positions in society.
Okay, remember your order.
Thank you so much. Excellent presentation. I have a million thoughts floating around in my head. I guess I'm really attracted to this idea of being able to take into consideration what people actually want. And I was thinking about it kind of in two directions. So one is, what happens if you take into consideration the ways in which like sexuality is used to begin with? So before you even enter the doctor's office, how might the fact that how people have sex, how that's shaped by the way you grow up or who your partner is and those such things. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you know, I would imagine when you are in a doctor's office talking about family planning, you actually have more choices to make than when, let's say, you break a bone or, you know, you get some kind of surgery. They're not going to ask you what kind of stitch you want. So on both ends, it's almost like you have more ability to make decisions and also more coercion before you enter. So I'm just, yeah. I mean, in some ways, I guess I'm broadening this, but how do we think about that within the context? And I feel like that was a really big question, so maybe you want to take more questions because we only have 10 minutes left. So
let me try to answer those questions quickly. Although I don't want to answer them quickly, I want to answer them expansively, but I'll try to keep it brief. To your first question about, this was very specifically a contraceptive autonomy project, not a reproductive autonomy project. So there's so much about the reproductive experience of people that is not included here. There's nothing about abortion. There's nothing about the ability to say no to sex, like things that really, really, really matter to reproductive self-determination are left out of here. Not because I don't think they matter, but just because one person can only take on so much. So there are some other measures of reproductive autonomy that focus on the intimate partner dyad and focus more on reproductive coercion as like a form of domestic violence that happens between two people. But to your point, I think much, much more is needed to link this sort of like little point, like dot on a map to its much broader context. At the doctor's office, we do have more choices than like how should we set this bone. I think hopefully in part because like fertility is not a disease or an adverse health outcome. Pregnancy is not a disease. It's integral to the human experience for those who want it, and for those who want to start a family in a certain way, it's something that is highly sought after. And so whether or not and how to limit that fertility, I think sort of by definition needs to become a much more personal decision. And it's also partly because we don't, like, if there were like one great method that worked for everyone, that would be wonderful. But we have sort of like an array of kind of bad methods that each have their downsides. And so which of those like side effects profiles or menstrual changes or like whatever the things are that fit your life better, really it's so like what's more personal than that to you. So I could keep going on, but I'm gonna shut up.
I think what we'll do is we'll collect questions. Okay, so you can hear where people's heads are at.
Also, we did have a comment online that it's hard to hear the audience. So if you
Repeat the question.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the great presentation, sharing your research. This is sort of related to the issues of capturing via survey questions, but I was wondering your thoughts on measurement with regards to alignment between providers and users on what coercion might look like. So I was thinking of a doctor who might, from their perspective, think they're giving full information by describing all the benefits of the implant, or potential concern technologies to the user that is having the implant pushed on them, and how you think about sort of measuring that.
Great. So the question was about alignment between sort of a provider perspective of coercion and a patient perspective of coercion.
Adam.
Hi, I'm Adam. Thank you for such a clear and compelling talk. My question is about the sort of method that you're thinking about and the sort of linked variable measurement with the dynamic responses. I'm curious if you have thought at all about using sort of unstructured text narratives and language models, which are, obviously advancing very quickly, these new methods, to sort of extract meaning from these.
Thank you. The question was about, rather than using standard existing survey methods, whether an unstructured text option with like large language models and natural language processing for analysis might be an avenue to pursue.
And then Steve.
So also thank you for an amazing talk and amazing work. And obviously you focus mostly when thinking about coercion and power kind of on the state and the provider and all that. As you dig down into choices, how do you think how do you think about power and gender in relationships and where that sort of fits in to women?
Oh yeah, Courtney.
Let me just repeat that one for the folks online. The question was about sort of the nature of free will, I think, and autonomy, power, gender, and relationships, and how women navigate those things in a broader sense.
And because you talked about the fact that this is also structural, have you also thought about questions that could put into the SWOT, for example, or the plan?
That was a question from our resident DHS expert about, in addition to maybe adding some questions to the women's questionnaire for the DHS, whether there might be some questions here that could be added to the service provision, SPA survey provision assessment, and the client exit interview portion of that, which is a facility-based part of the DHS.
Patrick, were you
Yeah, I do have a question.
Yeah.
I was not
I just
raising my hand
recognized.
at the time. But I was thinking about your survey, and a lot of the examples you gave of coercion in the beginning of the talk, I think are excellent examples. But those are extremely like vulnerable populations, and I'm wondering if you have plans to be able to reach, say, incarcerated populations, and then how to account for, say, like freedom of choice and freedom of information there. Like we can also think about instances in the South where like ICE containment engage in Mississippi epidemics too.
Yes, great question. So this question was about, in addition to sort of the standard surveys, we asked what efforts could be made to include particularly vulnerable populations who are often excluded from the enumeration of those types of surveys, like incarcerated populations, which is an excellent question.
One comment on the chat, which you can read, but I'm also happy to read.
Can't read it.
Okay, I'll read it. So what an amazing way to measure family planning. It's from Barbara Talkington. What an amazing way to measure family planning, getting into the nuance of family planning and the choices folks have while pulling apart the Western focused authoritative practices. Thank you so much. I wish I could have been here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That was just a compliment. So thank you.
Take it all. Take it all.
Yes. Okay, maybe I'll just take these in turn. Alignment between providers and patients on what coercion looks like. This is a really, really, really interesting question. You know how every time you do a study, you get back home afterwards and you're like, shoot, I cannot believe I didn't do this one thing. For me, that one thing was interview providers. I cannot believe it didn't occur to me to interview providers. What was I thinking? I don't know. I hope that we can do that in the future. They're sort of at this point, the black box for me. I feel like I have a really good handle on like what's going on at this like policy level, donor, how global health works for this purpose. And I have a really pretty good handle on what's going on among women, and we don't know what's going on with providers. So I'd really like to do that in the future. My hunch is that providers will probably have a very different perspective on coercion compared to the patients. And then the question becomes like, does that matter? Like if patients are perceiving coercion, isn't that what matters? But there's also probably for health systems purposes a really good reason to understand how providers perceive it as well. So that's part of the next step of this. Thank you for that. Unstructured text, as opposed to standard survey questions and using generative AI or natural language processing to understand that. This is a really interesting idea. And I think I might take this one with the question about people who are incarcerated, even though they're very different questions. My answer to them is the same, which is that I'm actually taking an extremely pragmatic approach to this. And I know that if I design some sort of special survey instrument that is measured really different from how population-based surveys are currently carried out, then no one will adopt this measure. So if I have to do a special type of open text survey that the DHS doesn't support, the DHS won't take that on. And can I convince the DHS or the NSFG to include incarcerated people in their enumeration process? I'd love to. I doubt that I can. And so that might be a really unsatisfying answer to like two very good methodological questions that go to the heart of inclusion and vulnerability and like understanding what's happening to the world's most vulnerable people. But for this specific project, there are no plans to do those things. Although I've thought about the natural language processing thing before, and it's something I noodled over. I've never thought about the fact that incarcerated populations are not included in this before. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And it is certainly something that I will, I'm sure, spend a lot of time thinking about. Power and gender and relationships for women. This is a really tough one. When I started thinking about autonomy at the beginning of my dissertation project, it occurred to me very quickly as I started reading that if I pulled at this thread too much, I'd end up reading like ancient Greek philosophy on like on the nature of free will, like does man have free will? And I wasn't studying philosophy, and that's not my ministry. And so I sort of very consciously made a choice not to pull at that thread too much. again, because I think this is a very pragmatic project. I have a very clear intervention that I want to make in global health that's based on this measurement. One thing is, again, that some people already are, there's a reproductive autonomy scale developed by some folks at UCSF that already tries to look at people's relationships to their families and their intimate partners. And so both that work was already being a little bit done more than looking at the patient-provider relationship, but also the patient-provider health system state policy aspect seems much more intervenable to me in terms of policy changing and measurement changing than trying to relate to like how someone to trying to change gender relations in a culture. The other piece to me that was really important here was I feel perfectly confident critiquing USAID. It feels less like my role to say that the women in X country are really oppressed by their surroundings and need to be saved from their oppression. There's like an imperial feminist thing going on there that I'm working really hard to avoid in this work. So, and that's a really common thing in global family planning. This idea that like these women are just sort of too ignorant or too poor or too uneducated to know that actually family planning is the best choice for them. That like imperial logic is something that I was trying to avoid. So if we accept that people in the US can make an informed choice not to use family planning, even though we have misogyny here for sure, then I think we should also sort of extend that same understanding to women in the global south.
Thank you. Thank you. You can get I'll find it first and then you can talk about it.
Oh, come on.
You can let me know.
Okay. Oh, is this a pop out if I send a link to this?